Now, in the afternoon, we are going to listen to Kristin Andrews, who is York Research Chair in Philosophy of Animal Minds, a very cool title, at York University in Toronto. And now we're going to hear about what ethical implications the results we get in the field can have. So.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. It's a daunting task I have to go last after all of these very interesting scientists getting up and telling you about their interesting findings. The question we were given for the symposium was, are other animals intelligent? And one thing we saw during today is that we might not know what we're asking when we ask this question. And we might, in fact, be disagreeing about what is meant by intelligence. And so rather than, I could, as a philosopher, spend the next 20 minutes doing that, talking about that, I'm going to instead say, let's say yes. Whatever thinking is, whatever intelligence is, let's say animals have it. And then, let's say other animals have it. But then what follows? So what? So what if other animals are intelligent? Are there any ethical implications that directly follows from a claim that other animals are intelligent? So in order to investigate that question, we might say, well, we need a premise to connect us from the claim that animals are intelligent to animals are worthy of moral considerability. What does it mean to be worthy of moral considerability? What that means is that something has moral standing, that they're a moral patient, that when we're deciding what to do, we have to consider that thing. We have to consider its interests. So we can ask the question, are all intelligent things worthy of moral considerability? Does intelligence in and of itself entail moral standing? And I think the answer to this question is no, because, in part, of the problem we have with figuring out what intelligence is. What is it to be smart? A lot of things are smart. We have smartphones. We might say that plants are smart because of mimosa plants that seem to learn and bean plants who seem to know when they lost a competition. And soon enough, we might have intelligent robots that can become our chauffeurs, or robots that can clean our house effectively, more effectively than they do right now. Are these things intelligent? We might say, yeah, we use that term. But they're not obviously morally considerable. We're not worried about how we're going to treat our phone or how we're going to talk to Siri right now. So intelligence, it seems, at least prima facie, is not going to be sufficient for moral standing. And it's also important to note that intelligence alone isn't necessary for moral standing either, because there are some things that we treat as morally considerable that aren't very intelligent, like maybe babies or dead people. These are biological entities that we value, that we think matter. And there are even things that aren't biological, that aren't intelligent, and are morally considerable, like nations or religious texts. These are things that some of us consider to be morally valuable. So how is it then that we can connect the science that we've heard today to the ethical question about whether or not some of these other species are morally considerable? Intelligence isn't necessary for moral standing, and intelligence alone isn't enough for moral standing. But still, there's a kind of intuitive pull that intelligence can be related to moral standing. Right? If you hear that something's intelligent, then you might ask this question, oh, do I need to consider it? Do I need to worry about this thing's interests? But not all kinds of intelligence seem to be prima facie, seem to prima facie matter in this sense. So we've heard about navigation abilities in the bees. You might have mental maps, and you might think a mental map is intelligent. But then you might ask, what is it about having a mental map that would make you morally considerable? Maybe a vacuum cleaner robot could have a map of your living room. and that might not make it morally considerable. So it's not just intelligence in and of itself or cognitive capacities and abilities in and of themselves that makes one morally considerable. It would be certain kinds of cognitive abilities. So how do we connect these and the science up with the ethics? I want to propose today that we make this connection using the concept of person. Why person? Why is person something that I'm going to go to? Well, there are several reasons why this concept of person is going to be useful for identifying the right sort of cognitive capacities for us to entail to derive moral standing. For one, persons have a legal standing that reflect their prima facie moral considerability. So for example, the Non-Human Rights Project is a civil rights NGO in the United States where a lawyer, Stephen Weiss, is arguing for legal personhood status for non-human animals, starting with chimpanzees. He's arguing that some chimpanzees that are kept in captivity, in the kind of captivity where they're not flourishing at all, such as dark garages in people's homes, that they ought to be freed via writ of habeas corpus. Right now, the judges that have tried these cases have said, I can't decide this on legal grounds. This is more of a social question. But what we see is this claim that Weiss is making that if these animals, if these chimpanzees are persons, then they ought not be held against their will. They should be released into appropriate sanctuaries. Persons have legal standing that reflect their moral considerability. Also, we have this idea that persons are political entities. Persons are people in our society, individuals in our society who we share our community with. So for example, in New York City, there's a public service announcement poster that's being displayed on subways that asks New Yorkers to see raccoons and other animals that live in the city as members of their community, not as pests who are to be killed or to be displaced. And in their book, Zoopolis, Sue Donaldson and the philosopher Will Kymlicka argue that given the kinds of relationships humans have with other animals, we need to include those animals as members of our society and give them the appropriate statuses, rights, and responsibilities. So for example, domesticated animals, which we've created via breeding, they argue we should give them citizenship status, and then we should appoint stewards to speak for them the same way we would speak for children who can't speak for themselves. Wild animals should be granted sovereignty over their habitats and their bodies, and the raccoons that live among us should be granted a status of freedom to live among us without being killed or exterminated or displaced. Oh, there goes my slide. So, persons, because persons are members of our political communities. And also, persons, because persons are prima facie things that are morally considerable. Persons are individuals that aren't necessarily biological. Human, because persons aren't humans, yet they still matter. So the Neanderthals, who were our great-great-great-great-grandparents, or the individuals that populate our science fiction stories, like Tuvok and E.T., we identify them as persons, and yet they're not human. So we don't have this sort of limitation. So by connecting the science to the ethics via the concept of person, we see that there are some moral patients that are not persons. There's some things that are morally considerable who aren't going to be persons, like maybe babies, or maybe religious books, or stem cells, or ecosystems, or works of art. But that's really hard to justify. It's really hard to make the arguments that an ecosystem or a work of art is morally considerable. But because of this understanding we have of the concept of person, if we can argue that a non-human animal is a person, then we get to moral considerability, because moral considerability is built into this concept. So this is not to say that if an animal isn't a person, that they're not morally considerable. It's simply to say if they are a person, then they are going to be morally considerable. So I think I want to say that pretty much everyone agrees that if anything's worthy of moral considerability, persons are. And when we see humans trying to justify genocide or motivate harm to others, we see humans acting to dehumanize, or we might say depersonify the object of that violence, because of this prima facie idea we have that persons are morally considerable. Now, the line between a person and a non-person is going to be a fuzzy one. It might be under dispute. And maybe we'll reject this distinction altogether, the person-non-person concept. But if we want to ask the question, what is the connection between thinking and intelligence of animals and their moral status, I think using this personhood concept is a good place to start, because we already have a vague idea of what persons are. We have a person stereotype. And we have, I think, a richer understanding of a person than we do of this notion of moral considerability. So let's start with this idea of persons. John Locke was one of the earliest philosophers who was interested in this concept of person, and his definition of person is that a person is a thinking, intelligent being, someone who has reason and reflection and can consider itself the same thinking thing in different times and places. This has become a very standard definition of person. It's accepted pretty widely in philosophy, but it's been elaborated on to a great extent. So, for example, the contemporary philosopher Tom Regan elaborates on the definition like this. Individuals are subjects of a life. A person is someone who's a subject of a life, someone who has beliefs and desires, perception, memory, a sense of the future, including their own future, an emotional life, feelings of pleasure and pain, welfare interests, the ability to initiate action, having goals, and have an identity of self over time. And that an individual who has these sorts of properties are going to have a special kind of value, inherent value, intrinsic value, by virtue of having these sorts of properties. So given the work of Locke, Regan, and a bunch of other philosophers, we can, I think, construct a fairly well acceptable account of our person stereotype. These are the kind of 10 properties that are really closely associated with our notion of what it is to be a person. A person is someone who's going to be conscious or sentient, someone who has a sense of self that persists through time or self-awareness, someone who can solve problems rationally, someone who has autonomy or free will, who can plan ahead and solve problems and formulate goals and work towards achieving those goals. A person is someone who has sociability or social relationships. A person is someone who has a moral agency, who we hold responsible for their actions. A person values their own existence. A person has a narrative story of their life. A person has a personality, has individual differences. These are all properties associated with person. These are not, though, all necessary conditions for being a person. And these are not all properties that come in an all or nothing sort of array. They're not binary. You might be a certain kind of degree. You might have a little bit of self-awareness and not a lot. You might even be a little bit conscious. People debate about whether or not consciousness is a binary or analog sort of property. Because of this, I think it really nicely reflects the kind of stereotypes we have for other social groups. So, for example, take the stereotype of woman. There are a lot of properties that we associate with being a woman. Some of them we associate more closely with being a woman than others. So, for example, having a uterus is something that is closely associated with being a woman. But not all women have uteruses. There are many different ways of being a woman, as something that we're realizing more and more now, as transgender women come to gain more attention from our society. So just as there are many different ways of being a woman, there are many different ways of being a person. And we can look then at different animals in order to see a different species, in order to see what their kind of personality profile or their personhood profile is going to look like by examining these 10 different properties. So I want to do this with one animal. And the animal that I want to do this with one species, is a chimpanzee. We've not heard too much about chimpanzees today, which is great, because usually at animal conferences, a lot of people are talking about chimpanzees. Why? Because they're so intelligent? Because they're at the top below us? No. Because they're more morally considerable than anyone else? No. Because there's the most science on chimpanzee cognition, because there are a lot of researchers who are working on chimpanzees in the field and in the lab. And that's why I think we hear so much about chimpanzees, not because they're that great. So it's lovely if there are any students who are looking to do research. You know, chimpanzees, it's hard. There's a lot of studies already done on chimpanzees. These other taxa, species you heard about today, those are the ones to octopus. All right, so, but chimpanzee, that's where we're gonna start. And I'm just gonna start with just granting that they're conscious. If you think I'm conscious, you should probably think a chimpanzee is conscious. I mean, maybe you're the only thing that exists, and this is all a dream, but probably not. And I'm just gonna grant personality. There's a lot of research on individual differences in personality in chimpanzees. So let's turn to the next four properties on this wheel: self-awareness, rationality, autonomy, and sociability. So self-awareness, we've already seen this picture of chimpanzees in the mirror self-recognition task. Chimpanzees are great at this, but chimpanzees are also really great at a chimpanzee version of the marshmallow task, at delay of gratification. So if you give a chimpanzee an opportunity to take a small treat now, or wait and eat a larger treat later, a chimpanzee will be able to restrain themselves. And they often do so in the same way that children do. They will distract themselves by looking at a magazine, as you see in the slide, or turning their back. And this is work from Michael Baran. So it seems that chimpanzees are able not just to recognize themselves in the mirror as themselves, but also able, to a certain extent, to think about their interests in the near future. Rationality. We saw a little bit of this already today, too. Chimpanzees make tools, and they use tools, like stone tools, for nut cracking, and anvils and wedges. And they use tools for ant dipping and termite fishing. And they make tools, including tool sets. So they make a tool to help make another tool to use to get the termites. In addition to these kind of field observations, in the lab, we see evidence of rationality in chimpanzees. Sorry, it's an orangutan in the picture, but chimpanzees do this as well. Engage in a kind of logical reasoning, deductive reasoning, called exclusion reasoning, or disjunctive syllogism. So if you have three cups, and one of the cups has food in it, and you're told it's not this cup, and it's not that cup, then the chimpanzee can infer, oh, it must be the third cup. All the great apes can do this, and dogs can do this too. Planning, autonomy, and chimpanzees plan ahead. This is where Santino, your famous local chimpanzee, arises. Santino famously, apparently was very crabby when visitors would come to the zoo, and so he'd stockpile rocks and hide them and wait for the visitors to come and then throw the rocks and pieces of concrete at people. Planning ahead, maybe not too nice, but autonomy, having a goal and working to achieve that goal. Sociability. There's a lot of research that's been done on chimpanzee sociability, from work including imitation. These are images of a chimpanzee who's imitating a human. Chimpanzees are able to understand when they're being imitated and when they're not being imitated. When they're being imitated, just like you can play the game with little children, and you start doing this, and then you may stop or you do something different, engage in contingency testing to see, oh, am I really being imitated? The chimpanzees will do that as well. And this is these three pictures are neonatal imitation of I think 3-day-old chimpanzee from Kyoto, doing the melts off, stick out the tongue, and pursing the face, imitating a human making these facial expressions as well. So we see imitation in chimpanzees. We also see cultural differences between chimpanzee communities. So for example, in some chimpanzee communities, it became really cool to put a piece of grass in your ear, and then everyone started doing it. It's only in this one group, no one else would do it. In other chimpanzee communities, it's really cool to hold hands when you're grooming, and everybody does it in this group, but not in other groups. And more recently, we found, researchers found that some chimpanzee communities engage in this rock throwing behavior where they throw rocks at hollow trees, not quite sure why. It's seen across different groups, but not in every group so far. So the point is that there are these differences that are non-functional, not based on the environment, that chimpanzees adopt and spread through the group. There's evidence that friendship, having a friend, makes you less stressed out if you're a chimpanzee, which I can relate to. There's evidence that chimpanzees engage in what we might call teaching. So these are a couple of videos of this. This is an infant chimpanzee who wants to fish for the termites and grabs at the mom's stick and gets it. Mom gives the kid the stick. And then the next slide is another image of an older, let me get sound. An older infant who goes to mom to get the stick, and instead of mom just giving him the stick, she splits her stick in half so that they both get to use it to go fishing. And the best for last is just recently, after 40 years, humans, maybe we should have talked about how dumb humans are, if we're going to talk about intelligence. It took humans 40 years to answer this question that they posed about whether or not chimpanzees can track people's behavior when they have false belief. Now we know they can. So this is a video of chimpanzees watching a film. Let's see if I can get this going. And the chimpanzee is, you can see in the corner, watching this film of a human who is being attacked by King Kong. So King Kong comes, and the human needs to get a stick so the human can beat King Kong up as well. King Kong runs into the left haystack, and then the human goes to hit the left haystack and then runs away. That's great. Here's another view. King Kong runs into the right. Human with the stick goes over to the right where King Kong is and hits the haystack. But then in this case, the human comes out without the stick. King Kong runs into the left, runs into the right. Human goes back to get the stick. What's the human going to do when the human comes back? And we know by the red dots are where the chimpanzee is looking. And the chimpanzee is looking at the rightmost haystack more than the left, which is where the King Kong was before, even though the King Kong left the scene. So in this case, the chimpanzee subjects are able to make predictions about what someone's going to do, where they're going to go, which haystack they're going to hit, based on what we might call a false belief that the human has. Whether or not the chimpanzees themselves have to understand anything about the concept of belief is a matter of a much longer conversation. But it's enough to know that chimpanzees are sophisticated enough socially to track this sort of behavior. So we might say that the chimpanzee personhood profile looks something like this. Self-awareness, we might have some evidence for. The different shades of green here are supposed to represent different degrees of having these properties, but this is just kind of a toy theory. I don't have a way of quantifying these different capacities, and it's not important for the point that I'm making here. The next one is moral agency. This is a much bigger topic. What is moral agency? What makes something count as a moral agent? One thing that we might do is construct another kind of stereotype for moral agency based on having norms, having different kinds of norms. And in some work I'm doing with a postdoc and students, we're looking at obedience norms, reciprocity norms, care norms, social responsibility norms, and solidarity norms in chimpanzees and cetaceans. And we see some evidence of some of these norms in chimpanzees. So we might put a little bit of highlight on the moral agency circle there. And then when it comes to the value, the self, and the narrative story of the life, not sure that we have much to say about that there. We can do this with other species, the other species we've heard discussed today as well. Again, this is going to be these are going to be toy models, but we might say that a dog personhood profile looks something like this. An elephant personhood profile might look something like this. And a raven personhood profile might look something, I'm going very quickly through these so that you guys can't get mad at me. Might look something like this. An octopus personhood profile might look something like this. And I made all these before your talks. So we've got this array of different ways of being a person. That's the point. And the point isn't whether these are accurate representations of the differences between these individuals. These are not a hierarchy of who's more of a person than somebody else. Just like having a uterus doesn't make you more of a woman than someone who doesn't have a uterus. These are all different ways of being a person. There's no sharp line either between being a person and being a non-person because it's this kind of a social concept. It's unlike other concepts we have, like alarm clock. An alarm clock has a certain function. If it doesn't serve to wake you up, it's not an alarm clock, or at best, it might be a broken alarm clock. But in these cases, the boundaries are fuzzy in these kinds of concepts. But counting as a member of a social category comes with it certain privileges. Being a woman gives you certain privileges. Being a person gives you certain privileges. No matter how an animal fulfills the category of person, by doing so, they gain moral considerability. What we do with them matters, unlike, say, what we do to this bottle of water. I can drop it on the ground and it would shatter. You might be crabby with me, but I didn't hurt the bottle of water. But if, some animal matters, taking it to the top of the building and dropping it does matter. Might matter. If they can fly, it's not going to matter. But that's the point. Even though we might say, by virtue of being a person, these individuals have, as Regan would put it, inherent value. Knowing that an individual isn't a person doesn't tell us what sort of behaviors toward them are appropriate. Some people need to participate in political decision making, and other persons can't participate in political decision making. So we need the science for two reasons. We need the science because we're curious about how animals work, but we also need the science in order to know what differences matter to animals, what we do with them and to them, and how it affects them. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions? So this was all crystal clear. No questions?
Here's one.
So you mentioned how personhood comes with certain privileges, but also if we're to consider persons autonomous moral agents, does it come with any obligations? Like, could they be held responsible for their actions in any way? Say a chimp or something that's antisocial or violent or whatever.
Yeah, so some kinds of persons will be held responsible for what they do, but those are going to be the persons that have a pretty strong morality component to their personhood profile. Not all persons are going to be morally responsible, be things that are moral agents. So we can think of a young child who already has a personality, who maybe isn't very rational or able to think about themselves in the future, but can think about themselves for a little bit of time in the future and the past, who can pass a marshmallow task, let's say. Someone who has some social relations with their parents. We're going to consider, we typically do consider such a human a person, but we don't hold them morally responsible when they act immorally, what we would call immorally, something that would be immoral if an adult did it. We teach them not to do that because we're teaching them the norms of our community. And we also see, though, in other species that there is a certain, in chimpanzees in particular, that there is some corrective behavior in chimpanzees. So Harada and colleagues have seen that chimpanzee infants who engage with dangerous objects in their environment, mothers will pull those away from them. You might see that as a kind of training. We see that chimpanzee females in some communities will hoot and wahoo if a male is mishandling an infant, if it looks like infanticide might be happening. There's a protest against that sort of behavior. So you might see a little bit of something that looks like chimpanzees holding themselves responsible or training or teaching moral norms. But certainly for us to go in and say, well, that chimpanzee is acting immorally and let's try them and put them, to jail for chewing off a woman's face, that's outside of anything that makes sense given the kind of definition that I use of person that's based on the species-specific nature and the specific kind of norms that that different species might have as well.
Thomas?
Yeah, great talk. Thanks very much. I really like the concept that you proposed, but I'm wondering how far you can go with the different species. Also, up to which step it actually makes still sense. We heard today in the morning about the Scala Natura thinking and that we shouldn't apply it anymore, and I'm very much in favor of that one as well. But if I now go back to your concept, you could, in theory, put every species in it, right? And you can basically color blurb then the different aspects. But what's about earthworms, for instance, or mites or hedgehogs? For some species, or actually for quite some species, for many species, animal species, most of your circles, the subcircles, will stay white or only have a very, very small color shade. And then the question is, okay, what does this tell me? What's your take here?
I think what it tells you is how much we need to worry about the different species when we're engaging with them. So if it's mostly blue and there's very little green in the personhood profile, then it might be more like the bottle of water than the human child. Like an earthworm, we might not have to be very careful when digging our gardens that we don't cut them in half because it might not matter to them, right? But a hedgehog, it might matter to the hedgehog if we step on it. I suspect you probably think it would be wrong if someone invented a game where you play baseball with a hedgehog as the ball. But not as another player, but as the ball. You would probably think that there's something wrong with that. But how can you then, how can you justify that intuition that you have that there's something wrong with that? You might say because it feels pain or, and pain is bad or something like that. But you can also use this personhood concept to say, well, because they've got a bit of these qualities that we associate with moral standing. Because if anything's moral, person's gonna be moral. But I think moral standing comes in degrees as well. It doesn't just come in degrees, but it also, we need to know what sorts of things matter to it. If I don't mind being killed, you're not harming me by killing me, for example.
So it's back there.
I wonder if you want to comment on what's the difference between, or why you think that other aspects than sentience or consciousness matter for moral patiency. Because to me, consciousness is the only of those that would matter.
The only one that matters.
Of those circles that you presented, for the hedgehog, for example.
Yeah. I mean, consciousness seems, I think, if you look at a person, so sometimes I say consciousness is all or nothing, and that's a necessary condition for being a person. It's hard to imagine being a person without the individual being conscious, without being able to feel and sense things and have a what it is like experience. But in order to remain open to the possibility that consciousness comes in degrees, which I'm a little bit drawn to panpsychism, a little bit drawn to this idea that there's a little bit of consciousness in molecules, in atoms, maybe. So Strawson, philosopher, Galen Strawson has a theory that what we don't really understand very well is physics. What we understand really well is the mind, and that in our typical analyses, we put it backwards. We think that we understand the mind very well, and that, physics really well, and the mind is a mystery. But maybe we've got it backwards. So in order just to remain open to those views, I say that about consciousness, that consciousness might be something that comes in degrees, and that being conscious isn't sufficient, certainly, for moral considerability. If an atom has some degree of consciousness, well, I don't know. It would make life extremely difficult. I think it's hard to be a Jane. I think it would be very hard to be all consciousness is morally considerable if you're a panpsychist. I don't know what I would do in the morning.
So one more question from you.
I wonder if there's something here that can be linked to conservation, because if you look at how conservation works right now, first of all, we go for charismatic megafauna. And secondly, we don't think about conservation until something is threatened, rare, about to cease to be a species. And I wonder if there's something here that we can link to conservation.
Yeah, I mean, so my kind of take-home message was that we need more science. Like, you all need to keep doing great things and training students to figure out.
We know that.
Figure out more things. And we need more young people to go into the science. So if there are any young people around, I can't tell. Because we need to know what matters to the individual. If we're anthropocentric, then we might think that vision matters to the individual. Or we might think that, beautiful landscapes matter to the species. And these things might not matter to the species. So if we understand them better, then we know what they need, and then we can move in and try to help them. And this is true of all different taxa, right? It doesn't matter whether you're, an exotic megafauna or, a tiny thing that lives at the bottom of the sea and breathes gases. But we need to know. We need to know more in all these cases. So I don't know that there's a direct connection with conservation, except in order to know what matters, we need more science. We need to do more science with an ethical motivation, as well as a scientific curiosity motivation. That there's a real, I think, ethical mandate to figure this stuff out. But you knew that.
Okay, thank you very much.